Hit it. All right, we're recording. Okay, excellent. All right, so today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Gordon Hewitt with us. Dr. Gordon Hewitt is an internationally recognized business school professor of strategy. He has been one of the senior faculty at the Ross School of Business, University of Michigan for 25 years. His research, teaching, and consulting interests cover the fields of global competition, business strategy and innovation, and the value added of executive leadership. His work, often in conjunction with the late C.K. Prahalad, has been at the leading edge of thinking about corporate value creation, corporate strategy, and corporate leadership in the new world economy. Gordon has received the International Distinguished Faculty Award for Best Global Educator by the Institute of Management Studies, whose members comprise leading academics and consultants worldwide. His many academic awards include his recent appointment as the Honorary Professor of Strategy at the newly formed Adam Smith Business School, University of Glasgow. Gordon has also taught as lead strategy professor on top executive programs for the said Business School, University of Oxford. As a corporate consultant, he has extensive experience of working at CEO and board level with many major global corporations. Gordon is widely acknowledged as one of the world's leading authorities on the challenge facing business leaders of creating value in dynamic, complex markets. He developed many of the original ideas about game-changing strategy and competitive disruption. In the UK, Gordon Hewitt was awarded the title of CBE, Commander of the British Empire, for his work in the field of international management in the Queen's 2007 New Year's Honours List. He has also been elected to Fellowship of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy of Science and Letters. We are very pleased and honored to have you today, Gordon. I also want to welcome several of Gordon's colleagues, the Dean of the Adam Smith College of the Business School at the University of Glasgow, John Finch. John, I see you on. Thank you very much for joining us today. And my partner, in a sense, my sort of partner MBA director, Javier, is also with us today. Javier, thank you for joining us as well, and all the colleagues and the MBA students at the Adam Smith Business School that are able to be here as well. You know, welcome to Mays Business School, Texas A&M University. Thank you very much. Gordon, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you. Hi to everyone. I'm very, very grateful both for the invitation to share some thoughts with you about competing in a disruptive world. And I hope you find many of the ideas practically useful, relevant, and so on to whether you're a student or teacher or practitioner. I hope you actually take away something today that you'll remember for good and not for evil. I have to say that I'm grateful that you've turned up for this. And to also remind you, this is not a new topic. The idea of disruption in markets has been going around a long, long time. And given that in management, Richard, we love fads, you know, the latest fad is, and if you live long enough, you live through the same fad 5 times. It's just they change their names a little bit as you go through it. I love this stuff about corporate purpose that's going around the world. I think I've seen that before a few times at my stage of life. But I think there's no question people are using the term, everyone, disruption, a lot more frequently than they did before. So there either is nothing there, I mean, it literally is just, you know, a fad, or there may be something there that we should investigate. And I'm going to take the second line to find out if disruption and the nature of it and what it does and its impact and so on is actually changing and is therefore worthy of our attention as scholars, as students, as practitioners, to find out what is going on so it doesn't surprise you. I always say, Richard, that it's very easy to analyze disruption with hindsight. You know, I'm a business school professor specialized in hindsight. We teach history very well. The question is, how do you get hindsight in advance? That's the question. And get yourself ready for those things. But if we don't diagnose what's going on and what the symptoms may be, it can be hard to get the firm in a position to cope with it well. Joseph Schumpeter a distinguished Austrian economist who eventually came to America, ended up at Harvard, wrote this book. Many of you will have studied it, I know, ladies and gentlemen, in your studies. And it's a real work of art. This book was called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. And in it, and it was published way back in the early 1940s, you know, he did refer to disruption very eloquently. And he talked about waves of creative destruction. And I think today in a media world, we spend much more time talking about the destruction and not the creative part. He said sometimes you have to put up with them both to actually make some kind of progress. And so although the term has negative connotation, you know, look, the English dictionary, when we talk of the word called disruption, it's usually got some negative karma to it. It's a break, it's hurtful, it's harmful. But I will argue that disruption is only disruptive if you are an incumbent. If you're a firm enjoying the legacy of where the industry and yourself have been, then there's nothing like that at all. And sometimes the other side of disruption, which is new freedoms given to clients whose needs have been ignored for long, long times, can actually come out of that process. And that's something I'll recommend to you. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Is there a reason why we should take this subject a little bit more seriously, given its fad status? I know, but is the frequency increasing genuinely? Where does it come from? And so on and so forth. And how can you, as the next generation of executives, get your mind in advance and not always to catching up in retrospect? So that's what I'm going to do with your help. As Richard said, very happy to take whatever questions, comments, ideas you have towards the end of our session together. So I'll go for about 30, 40 minutes, if that's okay. We have some slides that I'll be sharing with you. It's not as much a slide present. I don't do presentations. This is more of an ammunition kit. So I bring more with me than I'm ever going to use, just in case the conversation goes down a particular avenue that I can try at least to do some justice to. Can I also say, before I get into now detail after that little preamble, how grateful, Richard, I am to you and for advising everyone, taking the mist away from these 3 strings letters after my name, CBE. You know, my colleagues at Michigan, when I got it, they thought it was a new degree. They thought CBE stood for Complete Business Eccentric. And I said, no, this is a very serious royal award in Britain. You get down on your knees in front of Her Majesty. You have to take this stuff seriously. But the one thing I want to say to you is, and there's an analogy here with what we'll talk about, CBE and the honors that people get in Britain every year, at least show one thing, Richard, and that is the British still have a sense of humor. Thank gosh. Only the British could make you a commander of something that does not exist. You have to say to the Queen, Your Majesty, you made me a commander. Where the heck is my empire? I need something to control and command. And I think that's a useful philosophical backdrop for our discussion. I think a lot of the CEOs I've got the privilege of meeting today are finding, like the CBE, that the market they thought was theirs, the industries that they thought they just had to play Porter-like, forgive me, just working on incremental efficiency, quality, price, that industry is moving away remarkably quickly and changing form and changing shape. And they've been brought up in a world where they have to do industry forecasting, not industry reshaping. It's a very different skill indeed, especially if markets are both dynamic and complex. Please keep these 2 words in mind and connect them. They move both with faster pace. Well, we know that, but it's the complexity of markets. In other words, where things interact, much unlike the original models of economists that say one person's utility is disconnected from anyone else's. We are atomistic individuals. Well, go and talk to Facebook, go talk to Instagram, and we'll see how far that takes us. So I want to try and address today's world and see where that takes us with the commander of the British Empire. Could I ask you, Richard, do me a favor, could you put up the first inside slide? And I'm going to ask you a question. I know we kind of a discussion, and because I tend to be a discussive type of teacher, but we can think about it. So I'm going to come at this from 5 angles and say, this is why I think the subject's getting more airtime than it was doing 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so we can ask the question, is the reason we should take it seriously because the nature of disruption is actually changing. What we call disruption is not disruption today. Are the sources changing? What's driving this stuff? How do we build models of disruption in our brain that are useful, not just to protect ourselves, but to get ahead and to thrive in disruptive times? What's the impact of it? Is that changing too? Is that a new phenomenon we have to look at? And a big issue, especially for us in academic life, is disruption affecting our physical infrastructure or our intellectual infrastructure? Is it our brains that are being disrupted, not just our technologies? I want to come back to that later, asking important questions like, and some of my background, ladies and gentlemen, will come out as I speak. The best way is to not teach traditional case studies, just tell you stories of debates I've been in. But I was working a lot in the music industry round about the millennial years. I'll come back to it as an example later. And there's no question the music industry had a lot of physical disruptions over a period of 30 years as the world moved. This is for the golden oldies only in the audience, moved from records, vinyl, to tape, to compact disc. And so you could say, well, they went through disruptions, and physically you would call it disruptive, but their brains didn't have to change. What I think is now conventionally called business model. The idea of how is music stored, recorded, distributed, paid for, the elements of the intellectual model of what's the business all about didn't change very much until internet. It was internet that was the intellectual disruptor. And one young man from Boston called Sean Fanning with a business called Napster, that was disruptive for reasons I'll tell you about later. I was working with my great long time friend, C.K. Prahalad, most distinguished Indian-born intellectual of his generation. And we were doing a lot of programs through the business school up in Ross with Sony, one of the top 5 music label companies in the world. And it's fascinating to look back at how did they diagnose this thing? Did they think it was negative, harmful, or an opportunity to have a whole new franchise in the way we think about music and so on? And we'll talk a little bit about the challenges for academics and practitioners. So, Richard, with that, do you think they're ready for their first examination?
Maybe.
You did tell them they'd all get an exam, didn't you? Listen, I'm an old, as good friend John Finch will say, I'm an old-fashioned Scottish academic. You will get examined. All right. Here's the question to get us into this. And it's one that we all know about. Let's start with something that we know about. And we were the disruptors. We, the consumers, were the disruptors, not technologies or anything. It was the consumers who altered the nature of this game. It moved strategy, as I've been preaching for years, from the fundamental starting question, ladies and gentlemen, how do we play the game better? Incremental efficiency in the value chain. To what is the game and what are the rules and who's shaping them? So can you just imagine if you went back just over 10 years from now, back to the late 2008 or so, and you were having one of these off-site strategy days, and you were going to do a SWOT. Ever heard of a SWOT, everyone? S-W-O-T. It's the first stage towards managerial self-delusion. We're going to do a SWOT. As the Greeks said, those whom the gods wish to destroy, first do SWOT. It's all perception, all perception. And I want you to think, if you had $1,000 to bet, given the way we thought about the industry at that time, what a cell phone is about, and given our knowledge of cell phone companies, and you have a bet, you can either bet on the left-hand side or right. We know things can turn up that we never expected. But other things being equal, how would we apply our training as students, as academics, to say who at least seems to be in more of a pole position for leadership? Nokia, Motorola, or BlackBerry versus Apple, Samsung, Huawei. And we know what happened, in a sense, was that the phone began to lose the telephonic function as its principal reason to exist. I do some work with a British-based mobile software company, and they're saying that underneath the age of, certainly 30 would be pushing it, maybe even 25, the people who use the cell phones that use their operating system, the least used function on the cell phone is the telephonic part. I was listening the other night. I'm in Glasgow, it's my home city, because we're locked down here too, as you can imagine. And I saw very interesting adverts for the new Samsung model and the new Huawei model. They each took 90 seconds of primetime advertising TV, full of glitz and glamour and noise and flashing lights, people having good fun. The only word that was not mentioned in those two sets of primetime television was the word telephony. Not once did they extol the number of correct connections, the volume of the sound, at all. And it's a quick fast forward, because it's now at the stage where companies like Vodafone and so on are now discovering, as we knew, that the whole business is moving from telephony, from oral sound, to data. In fact, that's another issue about definition. I said to these guys, you don't give me data, Google give me data. You give me digital access to data. And there's a big difference. I used the phrase going the rounds in Britain just now, Richard. You're actually one of the first of the digital utilities of the future. You don't give me data. Don't kid yourself. You give me important power access to the suppliers of rich data. And I think, you can tell me if I'm right or wrong a couple of years down the line, I think we're not far away from seeing that some of the biggest mobile operators in the world will earn more of their global revenue from data than voice. That is disruptive in all kinds of ways to them, largely because most of the senior executives have grown up in a voice world, not a data world. That's what they've learned how to do. It's a very interesting shift that's taking place. If I can go further, could you go on to the next slide? It's called Evolution of Competition. Have a look at sorry, two back, please.
All right.
So that's one with Sony at the top, yeah. Have a look at that just for a second, ladies and gentlemen. I know we can't dialogue, but we'll do our best. I'll try and be the interpreter. I draw these things for a living. They're not the usual way we think of industries, which are graphs with numbers and percentages. They're just a picture in the brain of market evolution. And what does it mean? What's happening and why is it happening here? And this has happened. And again, we have helped cause it to happen. It's not because the companies doing it decided this is what they took over the industry and moved it in a direction. Reed Hastings, the American who is the head of Netflix, has this wonderful phrase that says the key is not just to give customers what they want, is to give them things they never thought they could have beyond market research. That's a big issue, as I know from my very well-schooled colleagues who specialize in market. What happens when customers cannot tell you exactly what they want in a meaningful way? And so what we're seeing here in this little graph is one of the first sources of new forms of disruption. And that is the big word called convergence. Convergence disrupts so many things. It disrupts the barriers and the boundaries between technologies, between software systems, between market segments, et cetera, et cetera. And all of a sudden we see here 4 markets that used to be thought to be separate as industries: PCs, mobile phones, visual animation, music. There were 4 separate boxes now beginning to converge into one battlefield. The reason I put Apple in the middle is quite obvious. Apple didn't spend this time. I was lucky in my life, ladies and gentlemen. I met Steve Jobs 3 times for long, full-day interviews. He was interested. You know, Stevie was a fabulous person. Many of you will know, even if you just read about him, that as a very proud person, it was a day of shame for him when he was fired by the board of Apple. The company he and Steve Wozniak invented. He was fired because the board thought, again mistakenly, what was the reason why they were losing out to Microsoft? Come back to that a little bit later. And so here we have a guy who's got a point of view about the possibilities for disruption, but from a positive point of view, because it's now pulling together into a new center of gravity 3 things that were formerly very different playing fields. And if you think of those things there, that is now putting Apple right in the center, right in the epicenter of the forces of convergence. As an architect, you have to be an architect of disruption, not just a follower of it. And essentially, if you look at the story of Apple, it's of course become this hugely profitable brand. And then you look at another question. I'll just ask you, generally speaking, I'll provide the answer. I think I know it. How many times do you see Apple on that chessboard before the convergence takes place? So if you were doing, as a student or teacher of strategy, if you were putting the nature of Apple in a box, a product box, an industry box, we would tend to think of them as a personal computer company. If you remember all those years ago, they made these candy-colored desktop computers. They're in one. So where's all this stuff about scale, scope? With one starting point, this is what they do. There's one company there that appears in more boxes than anyone else. Any guesses who that is? Richard, I'm going to put you on the spot. You're the guinea pig. This is a visual test, not a cognitive test.
Well, I mean, I would have said Sony because they're just they're across many sort of areas and so forth, many different product categories, and that would have been my guess. But
there's no question, Sony comes up 4 times. So if you were doing with traditional strategic analysis, what's our starting point here? What do we have that we can leverage? They are the only one of those companies who have experience of manufacturing and selling computers, cell phones, although that ended with a very fractious joint venture with Ericsson of Sweden, but they're back out on their own now. With music, of course, which I'll come back to. And of course, they have controlling stakes. Sony have controlling stakes in 2 of the major Hollywood studios, Columbia and MGM. So interesting, 2 questions. Question 1 is, in a converging world where convergence can be a positive or a negative source of disruption, because it's taking away the boundaries in our brains of where one thing stops and the next thing starts, how can you have all the parts of the jigsaw puzzle in your resource base and not make the big picture? Sony actually entered this period of evolution. Some of you may remember them. Well, I do, even as a younger person, used to buy them all the time. They were the former Apple. They had a great brand. Everyone loved them. They were the most global of almost all the Japanese companies before people like Toyota began to get into the act. But in terms of consumer goods, they had the Apple magic about them. And if I tell you that because of this, the impact of disruption in a scorecard is that Sony's market capitalization fell by 2/3 in less than 10 years. Not because they were not making great products any longer, they were still fabulous, but they were seen to be talking about the future of convergence as a disruptive force, but really not being able to do anything about it. Sony should have had it. Then you could ask the other question is, how come Apple, with only one starting point, pulls the forces of convergence together and is over $1 trillion now in market value? If you can, Richard, do me a favor. If you go on about 3 or 4 slides, you should see, I want to show it to everyone because it's come up anyway, the way I've been talking. It's the Sony Corporation slide. It's an org chart of Sony. Just after this, there, good stuff, that's it. Have a look, everyone, would you? There was Sony just over 10 years ago. What do we see? Well, we see product-based business units, nothing unusual about that. We tend to call them silos. Well, I could argue, as you could too, silos are actually good for you because they bring to an organization some important benefits. You get specialization, you get pinpointed knowledge, you get separate scorecards, you get transparency, you get accountability. So in terms of what I would call, I'll call it administrative clarity, we've built organizations to look like that, with people who head them with their own profit and loss accounts and so on and so forth. If you look at that again, just for a second, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to imagine what you're thinking. And you look at the range of things Sony has. Do you see the iPod there anywhere? Remember, it was Apple, not Sony, who got the industry free from the lawyers who wanted to prosecute kids who went on the internet. Sony had a huge music business worldwide. So if you look at that, ask yourself the question, given it was Apple who would be dismissed at a SWAT meeting, what do they know about music? They have no musical technology, they own no artists, they own no IP. This goes to the heart what I'm talking about, ladies and gentlemen. What does it mean to say, I know my industry? I deal with these giants all the time, great CEOs, and they say, often without boasting, they say, Gordon, I know my industry. And I'll always defer to that and say, yes, of course you do. But you only know it in its historical form, not its future form. And that's what you're competing for. You're competing for the empire to come back, albeit in a different shape. So if you look at all the resources that Sony has, and you think of what the iPod was made by Apple with no musical background, do you see the, Richard, lead the discussion again. Do you see the iPod here anywhere? Don't worry, I'll talk to Greg and to Eli after, get you an honorary doctorate for this, okay? For the pain I'm putting you through here.
Did you want to go to another slide?
No, I'm going to stick on this one.
See the iPod here.
You know the funny thing? Like the jigsaw puzzle, ladies and gentlemen, you figured this out, I know, without even seeing your faces. Sony had every element, hardware, software, distribution. They had the lot to create what became the iPod. But you know what, and this is part of my conclusions will coming up pretty soon, of what is the organizational equivalent of disruption. We've created vertical silos of accountability. But disruptive markets pay no attention to your org chart. I don't care about them. You can organize whatever you want. And for Sony to be able to do it, they would have to connect horizontally across the portfolio, Richard. That's my point. What were parts of separate accountable profitability units and manage both the vertical and the horizontal. Most disruption gives an opportunity to create new business and new industries at the horizontal intersection across. But most of our internal governance systems teach us about how do you manage for accountable units and so on. And just saying, you know, I know my good friends in HR talk of, oh, we'll collaborate. Collaboration is more than a process. Collaboration is not putting people in a room and feeling good, feeling happy, because we're respectful to each other. It's about bringing together, again, disparate forms of knowledge in a convergence to disrupt the old script and create a new form of knowledge. So here's another example of how Sony should have led the future of two industries. And it wasn't because they didn't understand the technology, didn't have a good brand name. It was because the business of trying to create both horizontal and vertical leverage is not an easy one for the modern corporation. To show you where else this is happening, Richard, could you go back and show everyone a slide called The Evolving Healthcare Landscape? This brings us to coronavirus. That's it there, good. Same thing happening, ladies and gentlemen. Disruption in pharmaceuticals, in healthcare, is being driven very largely by new forms of connectivity across previously distant forms of knowledge. And it's going to be interesting to see, and I already got one or two examples for you. You'll know them already in America, because America's leading this. I sit for my sins, I sit on the Global Innovation Council for Pfizer, world's largest pharmaceutical company. You put them historically, like Roche of Switzerland, like GlaxoSmithKline, you put them in the top left-hand box. They are pharmaceuticals. Their business is based on the blockbuster, very much like music. It's amazing. The blockbuster era. You go into labs many, many years. You've got to go through regulatory hurdles, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, clinical trials. We must not cause known harm to consumers. The most awful thing is toxicology. Can this drug do any harm? We don't want to end up like Merck did many years ago with a drug called Vioxx, severe analgesic, pain reduction, that they argued in court had a tendency to induce severe cardiac problems, including death. One of the largest payouts of all time. So you've still got the pharmacology industry with their knowledge up in the top left. But then you've now got the intrusion of the smart companies. Google is in it, Humana, whom I know very well, worked with Bruce Broussard, who's their CEO. IBM Watson, their supercomputer, right? The single biggest chunk of IBM's global research budget is now on healthcare. They believe that pharmacology has got limits, that we've actually discovered most of the drugs that have these large palliative properties. And they now need some very different. A few years ago in Switzerland, in Davos, McKinsey, the company, were arguing that data is the new oil. My slight rebuttal was to say, well, it'll a much bigger role to play, no question, in healthcare. But it's not data that's the oil, it's the insight that comes from data. It's not the data that's valuable. It's what insights you get from it and the opportunities it opens the gates for you to go in. So you've now got the Googles, the Humanas, the Watson Health, and they're playing a big role, companies like that, smaller ones too, in the great global search for a vaccine for coronavirus.
Hey, Gordon, Bruce Broussard is actually an Aggie, just so that you know that.
I always knew the guy had good taste, you know.
Oh, that's great.
He's a good guy, is Bruce. The work I did with Humana was like what I'm talking about. You can read about it. It was, how do you go from being a plain insurance company to a healthcare management company? Their job was not to pay out when people were ill. It was to stop them getting ill in the first place, which I'll come to a little bit later. The genomic sciences are now beginning to come in. I think they'll come in certainly in some way with coronaviruses, is being able from genetic coding to see the possibilities for the way the human body will play out. Many of you will know of 23andMe, run by the former number 3 in Google, Anne Wojcicki, who also sits on that Pfizer council I'm talking about, formerly married to Sergey Brin. And BioNTech is now the chosen technology, genomic science, and informatics partner with Pfizer, Richard, to try and get the first big vaccine out there. So now and a lot of people would say, you can't say who depends on who. The two are needed together. The barriers between informatics, smart data, and pharmacology are now beginning to disappear. But this is a new play for pharma companies, you know. The data they have tends to be on pharmacology, not on detection, not on precision. Even in our, as John, my friend John Finch and Javi will know, spearheaded by a team also at the University of Glasgow and Oxford, we're doing a lot of work on what they call precision medicine. A lot of medicine has been to take a pill. The way they make money is a blockbuster, you know, one pill, everyone takes it. If you have a small infection, 10 to 1, you'll get some derivative of amoxicillin, Amoxil. It works for a lot of people. But whether it works for you, whether you need 5 pills or 25, that's the way this industry is going. We're now finding that even hardware technology companies are changing. Philips, which of course is one of Europe's oldest, most prestigious technology companies. It was, in a sense, it was Europe's GE, light bulbs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They've now reincarnated themselves fully as a healthcare technology company. And their job is not just to have machines in hospitals that record things like blood pressure and so on, it's to do predictive medicine as well. It's a huge shift for someone like Philips. So Proteus, I know well. They are a small company run by an old friend of mine, used to work for AstraZeneca, Andy Thompson, based in San Francisco. They think like a San Francisco, a Bay Area company. Proteus, if you look at them, ladies and gentlemen, on the internet, are the first company to get basically regulatory approval to put a tiny ingestible microprocessor inside a pill. Now you have the beginning of intelligent medicine. Rather than waiting and hope for something to happen, you can, with an iPad, begin to see some of the impact it's having on the human body. Does it need more? Does it need less? Does it need more frequent? And so on and so forth. So in a sense, to give everyone an example, where I'm going in this monologue is to go from the idea that disruption of what we call disruption now has its roots in complex dynamic systems. I'm using complex for our academic friends in the sense of places like the Santa Fe Institute that I know well. A lot of professors from Ross do spells on sabbatical there. So if you have complex and dynamic systems, what it's leading to is a new view, as we'll see in a second when I start getting into some revision, of strategy not as how just do we play the game better, how do we play the efficiency card, but how do we do the new game creation card. And I think what we're seeing here, if you look at the bottom, everyone please, of that slide, we're seeing, and this actually brings it to words into life, is the past, the history of healthcare was we do curative. When someone has an aberration from being well, we try and get them back on path again. It is reactive, not in a critical sense, but we don't move in until the disease is occurred. There's something there to handle. And it's mass, so one person gets the same pill the world over. Everyone, it's basically immune to genetic differences. My prediction, Gordon, for what it's worth, all right, is to say well within our lifetime, and I think the coronavirus will accelerate this trend, we will see healthcare moving to the 3 Ps, I call it, letter P. This industry will go from curative to preventive, but to be preventive, you've got to be predictive, and to be predictive, you've got to be personalized. And it's not clear that the traditional pharma companies who just produce medicines that discover new molecules that go into pills, it's not clear they will be the giants of the future as they were of the past. How much time do we have left, Richard?
Well, it's 23 minutes until the hour. So it's really
let me go to a few so whats at the end of this. I would like you, if you would, we'll just do this quickly, okay? Would you go forward to a slide called Welcome to the New Game? Couple after that. That's it. So here's conclusion number 1, ladies and gentlemen. If you look at this more modern definition of competitive disruption, not just as a big clunky new technology that's come in like happened in newspapers, I think there's 4 things that leaders have to think about here. Do we need and how do we get a new world view of what competition and value creation are all about? What we thought was competition in the past, as we've seen in some of these examples, who are competitors? What are we competing on? How do we keep score? Do we have, as C.K. Prophet and I used to always argue, is market share no longer a good measure of market influence? Around the world, all antitrust, as you call it in America, all antitrust bodies are still working from 1950s and 1960s textbooks in terms of economics. Do we have to think differently, given my examples at the beginning today, ladies and gentlemen, of how you understand dynamic, complex markets and how the disruption there can give new freedoms, not just pain to existing incumbents? I think we need a new view of strategy, how you get from here to the future. Like Sony, it used to be I get from at A and I'm going to B, 2 sigma to 6 sigma. That's how we know how to do strategy, formulation, execution. But the new world, if Sony's trying to go from CE, stands for consumer electronics, hardware, to DE, digital entertainment, DE is not an easy thing to define, and it may keep changing. So how do we have an open, more flexible view of discovering futures through strategy, not just implementing them on a time scale? Given my Apple and my Sony example, how do we have a new view of organizational governance that a corporation must be beyond a portfolio of separate business units? If that's all they are, there's no added value potentially in the portfolio. And so solving for enterprise value creation, why didn't Sony not invent the iPod? Why did Sony not invent Not just administrative clarity. You could argue, if good friends of mine from old days when I get started in America, if Kodak really understood photography, what does it mean to know your industry? Why the heck did they not create Instagram? Do we still think of innovation as a product category, not a new market or business category? And I think a whole new view of change management. It's no longer this A to B world, better processes for existing games, back to Harvard Porter style. This is, how do you change the cognitive mindset? How do you make people see and sense the world very differently? Let me go to finish on this. I think this is the hidden enemy, everyone. We've argued for years, and business schools have done enormous work on this. is even though we know so much about change, why is it still kind of elusive? Where is the enemy? And often we deal with tangible things, well, it's structures or it's systems or it's processes or it's culture, it's behavior. I think the invisible enemy is something my great friend and I, Prahalad, called the dominant logic of an enterprise. And this is from cognitive psychology. Dominant logic is a set of invisible assumptions stored in the human brain that becomes your kind of cognitive map, the Google of the brain, if you like, that helps you categorize what's happening here. Why did Sony treat the kids coming in on the internet as people who were stealing? They prosecuted them, not saying, here's a great way to earn money in a fundamentally different way. And now we've gone through streaming and same thing happening. So I think the second thing, this new view of organizational governance, change management, etc. These are the four things I think would be useful to spend some time on. I think they have implication, ladies and gentlemen, if I may say so, personal view for what it's worth, right? Just personal. I think they have huge implications for the future of executive development in big organizations. I'm not sure we do a very good job of developing leaders who can do this stuff. I think it has some implication, if I may say, for the business school of the future, is how do we inculcate these ideas into still established ways of thinking about economics, about organizations, about change, et cetera, et cetera. Just to finish off, Richard, and then I'll finish. I want to leave this to a very distinguished historian. One of America's preeminent historians was called Barbara Tuchman. She won the Pulitzer Prize twice for literature, most unusual. But she was not a chronological historian, you know, dates and battles and so on. She was a cognitive historian. She thought a little bit about the evolution of systems and the hidden enemy that we call dominant logic. She wrote a book, if you could show everyone the front title of it, Richard. I call this the Tyranny. It becomes the enemy. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Next one, that's it. Her biggest seller was called The March of Follies. Wonderful title, isn't it? Folly is a strong English word that suggests more than a mistake. It's a kind of stupid mistake. How could you be so? How could you not understand? What didn't you not see or hear or get? There's a few slides in that deck which I've just not had the chance to use. It's all about what do you see, what do you hear, how do you interpret it, etc., etc. How do you translate that? If you start with the wrong answers to those questions, and she said, you know, it's like committing strategic self-harm. Her argument was many institutions get in their own way. They're on a road to folly, extreme self-induced stupidity. And the story I love is, by the way, 600 pages, a big read. She tells it in 6 stories of how the most smartest, best SWAT-induced in the world actually defeated themselves. But I'll give you a personal tip, everyone, is my way of thanking you for coming here. Why don't you give this as a Christmas present to your most hated relative? Because it'll keep them up for the next year, that's for sure. This is a deep, deep probe, a deep read. I love her. I come from a very poor family in Glasgow in Scotland, but I was sent to a school that specialized in classics. So I had to read in Greek and in Latin the story of Troy, told both in Homer and in Virgil. It's a great story. I don't know how many of you have read both of these books in their original language. I don't know. Okay, I'll ask a simpler question. How many of you have seen Brad Pitt? Let me start at the lower end of the spectrum, and we'll move up from there.
On TV or on the big screen.
Playing Achilles. But it's just madness, you know. It's this great institution, Troy, beaten the Greeks for 9 years. They come back again, the same thing happens. All of a sudden, when the Greek bodies are lying all over the beach, half the ships have disappeared. They wake up one morning. What did they discover at the front doors of the city? Something that looks like a horse, an everyday occurrence in the life of Troy. Another tram horse. I wish the post office would stop sending us horses. What's the horse made of? Wood. Where the hell do you get wood in a beach with no trees? Not asked. And I remember just a wee bit, the old Scottish of Latin, because the one guy who dared to challenge the dominant logic was silenced. He was the chief priest of the Temple of Apollo, the most sacred place in Troy. And his famous phrase in Latin, which has become an English cliche, was Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes. Timeo, a lot of Latin, of course, translated into English. Timeo is first person singular of the verb to fear. I fear, like timid. Danaos is the plural of Greeks. I fear the Greeks. Et in this sentence meant especially. Dona ferentes. Dona is the plural of donum, a gift to donate. And ferentes is the gerund for carrying. I fear the Greeks. Beware the Greeks carrying gifts. The dominant logic still held. It was destroyed. Let me go to the very last slide. To take away, I've tried to do 4 things today with you, is to, 1, having changed the context of why do we take disruption a bit more seriously? Because the roots of it are a bit different. And there's many of them, not just one. And it's not just a big new technology we've not seen before. And it goes to the heart of what business schools teach and how we develop leaders for the future. So I'll say, I think 4 things we all need to develop. I do it every day and try and see I use this box, which I created all the time. What's the one question I should be asking for some particular reason that I'm not asking so far? And I use the word acumen finally, ladies and gentlemen, because acumen is a very deep and probing form of intelligence. It's seeing things in a wider and a deeper and a more prescriptive way than anyone else is seeing. It's not just data. And so my 4 suggestions are, how do we develop a new competitive acumen, thinking about the nature of competition and value creation, which I've done in my early examples? How do we develop new strategic acumen? It's no longer like a financial plan where you're going from A to B, 2 fixed points that take 3.4 years. How do we develop new organizational acumen? How do you get around the iPod problem? Those of you working in institutions, you could ask this question today: what is our iPod and why are we missing it? And who is it who don't know what we know, but they know different things that could create and unlock a whole new opportunity by creating the iPod? And this new cognitive acumen is, how do we get our brains around dominant logic? What are the assumptions that go so deep and the practices that come from them? We don't even recognize, we're not conscious of them, but they're there all the time. They don't go to sleep, and they become the real live wire of the organization. Richard, I'm going to stop there and see what we have to respond to.
Sure.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for listening in.
Gordon, I mean, for my students that are on this, the high expectations that you have with regards to reading a book like that in the 2 original languages, pretty amazing. No, really.
I only remember the 1 sentence. Don't let me fool you, okay?
Incredibly insightful talk, presentation, Gordon. I think I've gotten a number of people that have been chiming in, sort of private chat. I've been trying to like manage everything, and a lot of them saying the same thing, that they want to get a copy of this. Okay, so we've got some questions. There was a question. Sean had actually reached out to me very early on and wanted to ask a question directly to you. So Sean, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask.
Sean, sure.
Yeah, I actually think the your concluding slide is interesting. It touches on that quite a bit. So, you know, hindsight is 20/20, and my question is, how can we? It's a 2-parter, but one question is, how can we train ourselves, our brains, and our behavior to identify where opportunity for disruption within is being missed for an iPod as a Sony in our company, and identify future disruptors in our industry before they harm our business, so we can either buy them, learn from them, work with them to improve.
Yep.
And then from the other side is, if we are the apples before anybody knows who we are, how do we train ourselves to identify opportunities like that to be the disruptors?
Sean, great question. Got another 6 days? But one thing, in answer to your question, Sean, it's fabulous. Let me go back to Richard. Richard, did we make a promise that all of our attendees, if they want, could have a copy of that slide deck? if
Yes.
you'd like.
So what I would tell people is I have I've been recording this. What I'll do is as long as Gordon's fine with it, I will go ahead and, as always, I will put it on our YouTube channel to, along with all the other speaker events. If you'd like, just shoot me an email and I can go ahead and include the link.
That's fine. What's the price for this? Have we discussed price?
We haven't discussed that yet.
I'm Scottish. What are you doing to me?
We can talk about it later.
What I could do though, and this is my first two-part answer very quickly to Sean. Sean, I've got a couple of, they're more executive briefs than the academic side of it, the articles, and I use them for clients and so on. If Richard is happy and Greg is happy with this, I can send a couple of these things to you that partially respond to those questions. How would that be? Just 2-3 pages, a kind of how to do it kit, but you still have to have read the basics. I think I'll give you the one-line answer is actually the link between dominant logic and conventional marketing, Sean. I think that there's two things you discover if you probe deeply into this field, into the complex theory. You discover that most disruption that becomes serious occurs at the edge of the industry, not the center. It occurs at the perimeter, not the core. And so if you have an overemphasis on the core, analyzing the core, protecting the core, you're going to miss this stuff. Or the people who work at the core are not senior enough to be asked for opinions. They're not the sounding board. The second thing I would say, and again, it'll be in one of the articles I give you, it's part of my sort of academic work, is I don't think disruption comes to you in PowerPoints. It comes to you in signals. It's the theory of signaling in markets. Like Napster, Sean, was a signal, right? But boards want 30 PowerPoints to give them data. I see you're asking the wrong question. If you had the data, we'd be there. It's how you interpret the early signals at the perimeter. So it's getting a thinking going about what are these weak signals? What do they do? I developed, again with product, this theory. I'll try and get it for you. It's called the double A algorithm. It's an alternative algorithm to look at a question differently. So instead of saying, well, kids are getting, it was the free, in economics, Sean, it was the free rider problem, remember? That's what the lawyers were worried about. You can pass it to someone, they can play it and they pay nothing. Gosh, in my living room in the old 1960s, we did file sharing. It was called record swapping. But no one imprisoned us. But the scale of it was bigger with the internet, And so seeing this not as a stealing issue, but in economics, it was a network system. It was a cost that goes outside the system issue, social cost, social benefit. So I think that's a second thing. Third, the last one, there's no question about it, is the disruptions that create fortunes for some people, so far, like the Netflixes, happen because they use disruption to unlock and create a new, it's not just a nice thing, it's a whole new category of freedom for customers, both of which begin with the letter U, Sean. They're unmet and they're unarticulated. In other words, people are not battering your door down to say, give us this. But a few years later, they say, the best compliment is, do you remember what life was like before we had this? But no one asked us for it. So concentrate on these two things. One of my articles will tell you, think about what are the weak signals we're missing and how do we get access to them? How do we interpret them early? And what are these big bonus benefits that change people's lives for the better, who are actually delighted at disruption? They're not critics of it. My years and years ago, I spent most of my Saturdays driving into the centre. John Finch will know the issue, and Javier. You drive into Glasgow in your car, you get a parking ticket, right? It's called City Centre Shopping. I go into the bookshop, I like books, okay, I'm an academic, right? And you spend your time in there with your head kind of at 45 degrees, because these idiots have never figured out a way to show you a book that you can read without having neck strain. And then you can't find it, and then the guy says, oh, it's not in stock, we'll get it to you in 3 weeks. Amazon did not reinvent a book. They reinvented a complex global logistics system. And the signal was, if they can do it in books, where the heck do you stop, Sean? You know what I mean? So I would just commend you and your colleagues to think about these two and have a meeting every few months, a dominant logic meeting. It'll come from the notes I give you. It's all the questions you should ask and so on. I don't think companies spend enough time on this stuff. And it's to be non-critical. We are human. We have biases. You know, a lot of work in university on cognitive biases. Well, partly there is no such thing as reality. There is only perception. Perception can be distorted, you know? So it's thinking a little bit about what, I would say 3 questions. What are the basic assumptions that go to the heart of our business today about competition and value creation? 2, which of these could be sidelined, bypassed even, by a change in the rules of the game? Disruption and game changing to me are the same thing. And thirdly, what do we do as leaders to move our dominant logic to a safer place? I would commend that discussion to you and your colleagues. Richard?
Yeah, and that I think that Sony example is just, I think it's just so straightforward. I mean, you having all those technologies, having all that right there in front of you, and not seeing the iPod as an unmet, that unmet, and clearly it costs them, considerably, as far as.
What I made was, I mean, it's not as if Sony didn't do it. I mean, they had lots of, the board was sponsoring, saying, please go forth and collaborate. But it was more of a team building process issue.
Yeah.
Not a new game creating issue. So they were saying,
oh, sorry, Gordon. I was just going to say, there was someone with a question. Aliyah asks, in terms of industry forecasting versus industry reshaping, what current industries do you believe can benefit from industry reshaping? She gave the example that you used, healthcare's shift from curative to preventative.
Yes. Who posed the question?
Aliyah, she's one of our MS business students.
Okay, thanks, Aliyah. Great question. To me, the number one, and I might try and show you some of the slides I have on that look like the healthcare one and so on. I would say anything that links media to internet and new forms of distributed technology is there. It's a massive one. Can't even describe the media industry today to what it was 10, 15, 20. I've worked just through the consulting side of me, Leah, that we all have. So I've done some work with the board of Warner, and also with a couple of others as well. Same kind of thing. And the crazy thing is, at least for that time of disruption, Richard, one of the problems we always have is, come the hour, come the people, come the knowledge. We didn't hire those kinds of people, not because we were stupid. We hired them for the old game. And that's what they know how to play. So I would say anything to do with the transmission of entertainment in any form is only at the beginning of the disruptive revolution. There's no question about it. I was just saying the other day, we're looking at, you may have seen the awful story of the stabbings that took place in my home city of Glasgow. It was a hotel that was used to home poor asylum seekers. It was sad to watch that stuff. The interesting thing is, newspapers today don't need cameramen or reporters. They're called Richard Castleberry or Gordon Hewitt with a cell phone. And it's real time. It's almost what Sky News did all those years ago. The battle is fought in real time. It's there. You have to send someone to the scene, And so thinking about your resources is a different question to your resourcefulness. Very different question. So I would say to the person your colleague who asked the question, I think the boundaries between traditional forms of media are collapsing. That will lead to disruption. The technologies required to access, store, and distribute it are changing forcibly. One of the things we're seeing, hence my example, Richard, of music, is one of the signals that Sony and the rest of them, Warner and EMI, home of the Beatles, all those, should have picked up, was one of the parts, there's a dominant logic slide in that deck that shows you the dominant logic of the music industry, Richard, right? It was work I did with Sony, but it could apply to their four, they came out with the same brain. The music industry had got into a comfort zone, Richard, where they only had 2 product concepts. You could buy the record with, basically 2 songs, 2 titles, or the one with 15. They made their money on the 15. So you buy the album with 15. How many of the 15 tracks give you infinite pleasure forever? Probably about 2. But you can't hand the other 12 back and say these suck. So the industry has been cross-subsidized in a sense. They are getting paid for value they don't create. So the reason I'm saying is anything where consumers there are what we call co-creators of value. You'll be doing this in some of your studies, I know. My colleague and I wrote some of the original stuff on it. What happens when consumers are not just endpoints of distribution? They're co-creating the concept as they go along. And so anywhere where you have customer co-creation coming in is a new form of innovation and disruption in the value chain. But that would be, if I had to put, who's got a red sticker, the amber sticker, I would say anything to do with what we would call media in its conventional sense and the technology that support it, especially if they're internet-based, they're right up there for disruption.
That's excellent. Well, look, we've reached our 1 o'clock time. I know a lot of my MS business students have class in just a little bit. Maybe if you have a few, let's say, closing words for us, it'd be great to maybe hear those words now, Gordon. Like Ryan Beeson, who's on, we could probably listen to you all day. But
you've been very kind. You've all been very kind and very patient, and I owe a debt to you. It's nice to be able to connect in this way. As you know, I'm old friends with a lot of the people, including the dean with Eli and Greg Markey and so on. I think you have a great future. I think one of the questions you will ask eventually is, do I want to be a Sony or do I want to be an Apple?
Yeah.
As a business school, as an institution. I have no doubt which one you could become, no question about it. But everything I've said, and I deliberately did not use examples in this field, Richard, everything I said can be applied to the modern university, everything. So conclusion would be, let's make it simple and cognitive. There's a lot of things you need to be successful in this world. Most books don't pay them enough justice. So what I want to say to you in saying thank you again, really sincerely from my heart for giving up your time to listen to this stuff. And I hope I can carry on living and writing because I feel we're just on the edge of another big revolution and ideas coming up here. So could I wish you the one thing, everyone, that's actually for business success more important than anything I've talked about today? Could I wish you good luck? And this is my new book coming out. It's a pretty crappy way of asking you to buy it. I've taken my cue from all of these get-rich-quick consultants, and I'm going to call it The 7 Habits of Highly Lucky Companies. Do you like it?
Well, I want to make sure to take a minute and thank Greg Markey for connecting me with you, Gordon. I mean, you have been absolutely everything he said you would be. Very, very fortunate to have him. So excited that, Dean Finch, you were able to join us. Javier, you were able to join. I think some of your MBAs were also able to join. Really.
Indeed. To thank them too. They've been fabulous, by the way. As you know, I mean, just a little plug too for Glasgow, my home city, where I started my career, 35 years ago plus. We didn't, as John knows, John and I know the story, we've been battling it for years. We didn't really have a business school that was up to the status of Glasgow University. This is the university in the year of American Declaration of Independence, where a young philosopher at the age of 29 called Adam Smith wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. There was no economics at that time. You come to Glasgow, as John and the others will tell you, everywhere you go, there's a building or a street called Kelvin. Lord Kelvin was the founder of modern physics. In that strange 50 years, what was called the Enlightenments between 1750 and 1800, all the new sciences that took over Europe, basically, still taught in the universities, all of them had their origins in this city. Business school will be next, and I'm sure John's done a fabulous job. And to get, as a brand concept, to get Adam Smith as the name is quite a big deal.
Yeah, and I mean, and honestly, during this whole COVID time, I mean, how cool is it that we were able to do this session, all together, with colleagues from, from Scotland. I think that's just so cool. Well,
Well, in saying goodbye, Richard, let me give them, I told you earlier, let me give them one view of Scotland they'll never see again. Right behind here, if you can still see these guys, is what used to be one of the shipyards on the Clyde. This is where they built the world's most famous ships. Talk of disruption. One of the theses I had to do after graduating first time, I talked about the future of shipbuilding. I said it would be in my lifetime, the Greeks, back to the Greeks again, and the Koreans would push Scotland away from this. We built here the QE2, you heard of it? The new Queen Mary, they were all built here just behind me.
wow.
There were 60,000 people in that industry when I was a postgraduate student. There's now less than 500, and they're all doing defense work. Things can change. And so I said to Richard, something very unusual happened to me. While I was just getting ready, I said, excuse me, I'm going to put off the air conditioning in our apartment. Did you get those words, everyone? A Scotsman in Glasgow saying he was going to put off the air conditioning. All we do is we turn the central heating up higher. When my US friends said, when's a good time to come to, when can I play golf, Gordon? When's a good time for the weather? So the only thing I can tell you is in August, the rain is warmer than it is in May. That's all I can tell you.
Playing under the umbrella, exactly.
Thanks to all of you in the audience. I really appreciate your interest and your attendance here. I do say thank you very much to all of you.
Yeah, and thank you very much for being here, and very insightful presentation. I see everyone clapping. Woo! And again, all the colleagues that joined from Scotland, thank you so much for joining us. All of our students,
MBA students, thank you.
yes, all Mays Business School. Woo! Excellent. Thank you, Gordon. We'll be in touch.
Will do. I'll send you that stuff. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Gordon.
Snow, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm okay. Thanks for your meeting. Yeah. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thanks again.
John. See you.
Yes, no, good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah,
Yeah, take care and stay safe.
okay, bye.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Richard. It was great.
Yeah,
Thank you
very
all.
much.
Thanks for tuning
Bye.
in. And for all the backup work you did to support this. Thanks, Javier.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah,
That was great.
yeah. Thanks so much
Thank
for joining us, guys. It was excellent to have you here.
No, it's good. We, as I mentioned in the chat, we should do something else like this. That was a really interesting session, and I know our academic years are a little bit out of synchronization with one another, but having Gordon being able to bring your insight from the business in the States as well, it just resonated. It was really impressive. So, thanks.
Yeah, I'm definitely I'll definitely keep you guys in mind. You know, I was telling Gordon one of the positive things that has come out of this whole COVID-19 has been the ability to do this very special guest speaker series with individuals that would never normally be available. I mean, I was telling Gordon, I've had, you know, General David Petraeus, I've had General Wesley Clark on. I mean, people that, you know, they're flying all over like Gordon, they're flying all over, they're, you know, on conferences all the time. But just, you know, given the circumstances, they're able to do a 1-hour session with, you know, with our students. We should kind of think of someone that maybe all of our students would be really, you know, really excited to see, and we could maybe put something together. We could do a joint thing. It'd be fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely,
Yes.
I'll continue to act as the go-between if you'd like. Easy.
Thank you, Gordon.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Sounds
We will keep in touch, Richard, and we will figure out something on
most
the
definitely.
edges or at the core, whatever.
Excellent. I'm always up for creative ideas. So if there's anything that, you know, crosses your mind, this is outlandish, you know, reach out to me, because we'll try to see if we can make it.
Richard, will you do me a favor? The promise to the gentleman who asked the good questions, make sure, maybe send me an email if you've got a moment tomorrow afternoon, your time,
Sure.
just to make sure that, well, you've got, certainly as of now, you can send the electronic copies of those slides.
Okay.
Attendees. With my compliments, okay?
Well,
The
thanks.
articles that I promised them that might help them be a memento, but I'll start to send those to you hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. Okay.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, and best of luck, everyone. Best of luck.
Yeah, absolutely.
You
Very
know,
much so. Yeah,
challenging
Okay.
times. Stay
yeah.
good.
Yeah. All right, we will. All right then. See
Okay.
you all later.
Bye-bye.
See some of you
Thank
soon
Take
in
care.
person. All right. I hope anyway. Not too far away. All right. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.